Beneath the marble and gilt, a different world breathed dust and heat. Workers in the 1970s uncovered tunnels and rooms that official plans never showed. For every glittering ballroom above, there were hidden corridors below where men and women toiled unseen. The breakers' grandeur had a secret scaffolding made of soot, schedules, and silence. When preservation teams began cataloging the breakers' lower levels in 1972, they found more than a damp basement. Maps in the Preservation Society's files and the mansion's archival plans did not match what the crews were scraping away. Where the blueprints recorded a dozen staff chambers, the excavations suggested nearly double that number. Coal and ash streaked the stone walls in long, dark ribbons. Ventilation grates were corroded, many patched crudely in later repairs. These physical traces confirmed something visitors had long intuited but rarely saw expressed. Servant life at the breakers was organized, intense, and spatially segregated from the family's public life. The discovery forced curators to rethink the house as a system rather than a set of rooms. The tunnels were not mere storage passages. They connected coal stores, laundry operations, kitchens, and service stairs, meant to move staff quickly and invisibly. Written notes from the estate's transfer to the Preservation Society corroborate that staff quarters were layered both on upper entresols and down in serviceable basements. But the material evidence found in the 1970s expanded that picture considerably. For historians and preservationists, this was a crucial recalibration. The breakers had always been read as an icon of opulence. The newly documented below-stairs network made clear that opulence required a hidden human engine. While the glittering rooms above told a story of accumulation and display, the tunnels and patched vents below told a quieter, harsher story about labor, exposure to coal, and the architectural choices that kept those who served physically and socially out of sight. In the early 1890s, Cornelius Vanderbilt II set an ambition that would reshape Bellevue Avenue. He purchased the Laurelard property after the earlier house burned and engaged Richard Morris Hunt to design a summer palace that would eclipse other Newport cottages in scale and taste. Hunt, already the family's preferred architect, drew on Italian palazzo models and the Beaux-Arts vocabulary to create a house of white limestone, imported marbles, and elaborate carved interiors. Construction proceeded swiftly and on a monumental scale between 1893 to 1895. Contemporary contracting records and later architectural surveys record an enormous workforce. Accounts circulated at the time and preserved in later studies claim that thousands of laborers, artisans, and masons worked on site in rotating shifts. Skilled Italian and French artisans were specifically recruited for stone carving, plasterwork, and ornamental finishes. Many of these craftsmen lived in temporary accommodations on or near the property during the work, a common practice on large Gilded Age projects when specialized artisans were brought from Europe for weeks or months at a time. Financially, the project was exceptional in its audacity. Period reporting and subsequent architectural histories place the cost in the multiple millions of dollars of the time. Such sums funded not only imported materials and fine furnishings, but also an extensive supporting infrastructure meant to house, feed, and conceal the staff, whose labor would animate the household. Vanderbilt insisted on fireproofing elements for the mansion, using masonry and steel to reduce the presence of combustible materials in the main structure. He also required that certain mechanical systems be located away from family spaces, a decision that both protected the house and concentrated heat and soot into service areas. Hunt's plan produced a residence that was both public theater and private machine. The visible architecture served display, while the invisible systems, mechanical rooms, service corridors, and staff chambers were integral to how the house functioned. The scale of resources expended and the concentrated labor force made the breakers a landmark of Gilded Age construction and of the social arrangements that attached lavish display to an often hidden working class. Richard Morris Hunt's composition at the breakers did not stop at grand staircases and painted ceilings. The mansion's logic depended on a bifurcated spatial order. The family and their guests occupied luminous, ornamented rooms designed for spectacle. Staff, tools, and the hard mechanics of daily life were routed into a parallel, subterranean order that kept labor out of the curated view. Building permits, architectural descriptions, and the mansion's known layout show that the service level was deliberate in plan and execution. Plans and descriptions emphasize separate construction phases and explicit decisions that located boilers and heavy functions away from living rooms. The boiler plant and fuel stores were placed in insulated underground chambers to limit risk and odor. Laundry operations required large, heat-intensive rooms with steam equipment and drying racks. Kitchens were positioned and ventilated to draw smoke and cooking smells away from dining areas. All these choices affected where people worked and how long their days lasted. The breakers' internal circulation patterns made that separation physical. Service staircases, tight corridors, and entresol-level bed chambers allowed staff to travel between work zones while avoiding principal rooms. The third-floor staff wings and attic quarters provided dormitory-style sleeping arrangements and proximity to service areas. Servants' entrances and back of house, corridors wound under and behind the public sequence of rooms, enabling footmen, housemaids, and cooks to appear precisely when required and to disappear just as quickly. This invisible architecture was not merely functional, it was social architecture. By design, the mansion's plan enforced class distinctions spatially. The building's monumental public face required a hidden counterpart responsible for the hours of preparation that made leisure appear effortless. In effect, the breakers' beauty depended on a deliberately organized infrastructure of labor that the house's plans both concealed and made possible. Keeping the breakers ready for a night of formal dining or a weekend of summer hospitality required a permanent, regimented staff. Payroll lists, household account books, and contemporary descriptions of Gilded Age mansions illustrate a household staffed by dozens of specialists. The breaker's household typically employed between 30 and 60 people in roles that ranged from butlers and valets to cooks, scullery maids, laundresses, coal stokers, gardeners, and chauffeurs. These employees supplied the muscle and skill that made the estate operate during the family's seasonal residency. Work at the breakers ran on long, repeated cycles. Kitchen staff prepared multi-course meals that were often planned and staged many hours in advance. Housemaids tended bedrooms and public rooms with exacting standards of polish and order. The boiler rooms required continuous attention. The estate's boilers consumed large quantities of coal annually, and feeding the furnaces was a physically demanding task, carried out by men who worked close to ovens and streams of heat. Contemporary sources for large houses of the period compare these stokers' conditions to those of steamship engine rooms in intensity, if not scale. Living conditions varied by rank. Senior servants like the housekeeper, butler, and head cook occupied small, private suites of rooms on service floors. Lower-ranked workers often shared cramped chambers in attic or entresol spaces. Heat, coal dust, and long hours shaped daily life. Medical entries and local hospital records for the period show that heat-related illness and respiratory complaints affected service workers in industrial and domestic settings alike. While wages and the provision of room and board made estate work tolerable for some, the physical toll and social restrictions were undeniable. The human engine of the breakers made opulence possible, but it also required a concentrated labor force that moved and labored around the clock. That labor was structured, documented, and essential, yet it remained mostly absent from public accounts of the house for decades. The history of the breakers is bound to the life and decline of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. He oversaw the estate's completion and the early years of its use as the Vanderbilt family's summer residence. In early August of 1896, Cornelius suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage that left him partially paralyzed. Medical correspondence and contemporary newspapers record a marked reduction in his mobility after the event and the need for full-time care. After the stroke, the way the family used the house changed. Cornelius spent more time on the first-floor suites and terraces that were laid out to accommodate visitors and public life. Letters and family papers show that he watched work being done on the grounds from a wheelchair and increasingly relied on attendants and nurses for everyday support. The family adapted household routines to ensure that their patriarch could still appear in public for limited periods while avoiding the strain of the mansion's upper floors. Cornelius's diminished mobility also illustrates the disjunction between a house designed for display and the human fragility that can interrupt it. The breakers, built to stage social power, became simultaneously a stage and a restraint. Cornelius's eventual death in September of 1899 brought these tensions into sharper focus. He had lived only a few summers fully unencumbered in the house that had cost a fortune to build and even more to sustain. The family continued to maintain the estate, but his decline and passing underscored the human costs that sometimes accompanied Gilded Age showmanship. After Cornelius's stroke and through the end of the century, the house's use and management adapted to changing family needs and the realities of upkeep. Alice Vanderbilt, his widow, remained the custodian of the house and its contents. Family correspondence shows that during these years, the estate required extraordinary resources to maintain a style of life that depended on both servants and the constant renewal of decorative finishes and mechanical systems. Alice's letters to relatives and friends reveal how the mansion's scale became itself a burden. She documented adjustments to how rooms were used and the limits imposed on Cornelius's movements. He watched from the terrace as gardeners and workmen moved about the grounds. The family's daily life at the breakers during these seasons grew more confined to public and ground floor rooms, while staff maintained the rest of the house for guests and for the family's occasional private use. Financial records and estate ledgers show the costs of maintenance mounting rapidly in the early decades of the 20th century. Property taxes, heating and fuel bills, and wages contributed to a rising expense profile. The expense of keeping such a large house in show condition only intensified as the decades passed and as the family's priorities shifted. For servants, these years meant continued long hours and strict routines. The architecture and household protocols that had been perfected to run the house did not disappear when the family's needs changed. Instead, they persisted as a complex system that required the uninterrupted labor of many people behind closed doors. The declining years at the breakers were therefore not only about the family's changing relationship to the house, they were also about the persistence of the hidden labor required to keep a magnificent residence functional and presentable to the world. Those operations quietly continued even as the family's direct use of the mansion narrowed. Maintaining the breakers was financially and humanly costly. Household expense accounts, insurance claims, and period medical reports give a partial accounting of incidents and the recurring health burdens associated with intense, heat-driven work. The nature of coal-fired boilers, steam-driven laundry, and the physical demands of large-scale food preparation made certain kinds of workplace injury and illness more likely among domestic staff of large estates. Documented incidents include burns from steam pipes and scalding equipment in laundry and kitchen areas, and respiratory irritation associated with coal dust and confined hot spaces. Insurance ledgers from similar estates record claims for workplace injuries in service areas, and local hospital records from the era note cases among domestic workers treated for exhaustion and heat-related conditions. While these records do not always name specific houses, the pattern is consistent across Gilded Age household archives and public health reports. They make clear that the invisible infrastructure of luxury had recognizable health costs for the people who operated it. Wages for domestic staff were modest for the skills and hours required. Ledgers show payments and in-kind provisions, such as lodgings and meals. The discrepancy between the value represented by the house and the monetary reward given to those who sustained it was stark. For the wealthy family above, the breakers embodied status and taste. For those below, the house produced relentless cycles of labor, risk, and modest compensation. The human and economic costs, therefore, sit at the center of any honest account of such residences. Counting these costs shifts the narrative from a dazzled admiration to sober appraisal. The breakers can be read as a technological wonder and a social document. That duality prompts a question about who benefits from grandeur and who pays for it in sweat, exposure, and danger. Even as Cornelius's health declined, the breakers continued to stage the rituals of high society. The mansion's staff performed labor-intensive preparations for dinners, dances, and receptions that required coordination across the household's multiple service areas. Menus and preserved guest lists from the period reveal the scale and precision of entertainment that the house routinely offered. A formal Gilded Age dinner could demand a day's worth of staging. Pastry and confectionery work, elaborate soup and fish courses, roasted meats held hot and carved at the sideboard, and final plated desserts required synchrony among cooks, pastry chefs, footmen, and silver keepers. That orchestration depended on the hidden circulation paths and staging rooms described in earlier chapters. While guests saw polished crystal, gleaming plate, and attentive presentation, the preparatory work had commenced long before the first carriage arrived. The illusion of ease and leisure was therefore a practiced appearance. Staff labor was timed down to turns and sweeps. The butler and the housekeeper managed staff allocations. Footmen and valets presented an air of unobtrusive attentiveness. The mansion's design supported this choreography by providing spaces where service could be executed efficiently, yet remain invisible. The breakers' role as a social theater demanded this invisible workforce and the architectural solutions that kept them out of sight. What guests experienced as effortless hospitality was sustained by a network of workers whose labor was intense, routinized, and largely unacknowledged in social descriptions of the time. The breakers' brilliance thus depended both on artistic mastery and on an industrialized domestic labor system that was meticulously organized and tightly controlled. The summer of 1899 was the last in which Cornelius Vanderbilt II would participate fully. His health had been fragile for several years, and family correspondence from that season reveals frustration and fatigue. Letters from Alice Vanderbilt convey the emotional strain of balancing care for her husband with the management of a vast estate and the social obligations that accompanied it. As the season moved toward autumn, Cornelius's condition worsened. He died in September of 1899. His death closed a chapter on the family's early, intense use of the house and marked the beginning of a long period in which the breakers would pass through different hands and changing uses. The family retained ownership and continued to maintain the estate, but the frequency and nature of social seasons evolved with changing family priorities and national circumstances. Estate ledgers from that era show staggering maintenance costs. The expense of heating, staffing, property taxes, and repairs accumulated rapidly. In modern comparisons, the annual cost of maintaining such a country house would run into the millions. For a property used primarily during the summer months, the ratio of cost to occupancy highlights how such estates were economic statements as much as residences. The final summer of Cornelius's life therefore stands as a symbol of greater tensions. The house that had been built to display wealth and cultivate social status also required continuous attention. When the family's primary patron lost capacity, the strain of maintenance became even clearer. The breakers continued, but the context had shifted. The manor remained a monumental artifact of an era in which wealth, Labor and spectacle were tightly entangled. When the breakers opened to public tours in 1948, the mansion entered a new life as a cultural artifact. For decades, the tours emphasized the artistry of architecture and the splendor of interiors. Access to service areas was limited or omitted to protect fragile materials and for safety reasons. That changed with the Preservation Society's acquisition of the property in 1972 and later restoration projects that revealed more of what lay beneath the public surface. Restoration work beginning in the 1970s exposed the scale of behind-the-scenes operations and prompted curators to foreground staff histories in interpretation, scheduling boards, wage ledgers, and personnel records that entered institutional archives illuminated the rhythms and hierarchies of service. Preservation programming now often includes a focus on the people who worked in Gilded Age houses and the conditions they faced. Guided tours and special behind-the-scenes programming invite visitors to consider the house as both a masterpiece of design and a complex workplace. The Preservation Society's stewardship reframed the breakers as more than a shrine to wealth. It became a teaching site about labor, technology, and the social orders of an earlier time. The contrast between gilt and grime, ballroom and boiler room, came into sharper relief. Modern interpretation acknowledges the human costs of maintaining such a place while preserving the architecture and stories for future audiences. Today, the Breakers stands as a layered document. It displays exceptional craftsmanship and historical opulence while also carrying the material traces of those whose labor sustained it. The mansion's legacy therefore asks a hard question. How do we honor both artistry and the people who made it possible? As a public museum, the Breakers now invites visitors to inhabit that complexity, to admire the house, and to remember the lives that ran its unseen machinery. For generations, the people who powered this mansion stayed invisible, their footsteps echoing in corridors no guest ever saw. If you want more stories that drag the spotlight back to those forgotten lives, hit the like button and subscribe. There are far darker truths buried under other Gilded Age estates, and we're just starting to dig.